In a small town courtroom, Maria Williams stood at the front with her hands folded together as she waited for the judge to speak. She had been here before, not for anything serious, but this time it felt different. The room seemed colder, her palms were clammy, and her heartbeat was slightly faster than usual. Maria was a woman who had always prided herself on being responsible and level-headed, but today something seemed off. She had been pulled over for speeding through a construction zone, a minor violation at best, but the officer who stopped her had given her a citation, and now she found herself standing in front of Judge Thomas Reynolds, a man known for his stern demeanor and quick judgments. As the judge flipped through the papers in front of him, he barely looked at Maria. His gaze was more focused on the citation and the fine amount. He didn't take the time to look at her face or consider who she was. He wasn't interested in the details. He had seen many cases like this before. Young woman in a car speeding through town, the typical routine for small-town law enforcement. There were no real stories to tell, no real complexity to the situation, just another person who broke the rules. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was as cold and impersonal as the rest of the room. He addressed Maria with the same lack of warmth he would give any other defendant in her position. Your fine for this violation will be $150, he said, and you are required to pay within 30 days. The judge's tone was final and dismissive. Without a hint of empathy or understanding, Maria nodded silently, her eyes downcast as she fought the urge to speak up. She could have said a lot of things about why she was speeding, but she knew it wouldn't change the outcome. This was just the way things went. In the courtroom, Maria had always felt like she was at the mercy of a system that didn't care about her struggles or who she was. It didn't matter that she was a woman who had spent years overcoming obstacles in her life, or that she was pursuing something extraordinary on her own terms. None of that mattered here in this moment. All that mattered was the fine and the judgment it carried. When she left the courtroom, the cold air outside felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the fine that stung, it was the feeling of being overlooked and dismissed. She couldn't shake the thought that Judge Reynolds had barely seen her as an individual, just another person who had made a mistake and was being punished for it. Maria took a deep breath as she walked down the steps of the courthouse, determined to keep her composure, but inside she couldn't help but feel a deep frustration. She had worked so hard to get where she was, and yet here she was standing in front of a judge who couldn't be bothered to see her for who she truly was. It wasn't just the fine, it was the way he had treated her, as if she was just another nameless face in the system, not someone who had dedicated years to achieving something few people ever would. She was a woman who had fought to become a certified pilot, overcoming obstacles most people couldn't even imagine, and yet to him, she was just another defendant caught in the gears of a broken system. As Maria walked away, she reminded herself to keep moving forward. She had more important things to focus on than this one moment. This fine didn't define her. She would rise above it, like she always had. As Maria made her way down the courthouse steps, she felt the weight of the fine pressing down on her shoulders. But it was more than just the financial penalty. It was the judgment, the feeling of being reduced to a stereotype she had fought so hard to escape. She had dealt with the assumptions all her life. People seeing her as just another black woman in a world that often overlooked her potential. But today, in that courtroom, it felt different. The judge had barely looked at her, had barely seen her for who she was. He didn't know that she was one of the few women of color to graduate from an intensive pilot training program, that she had fought against the odds to reach a place of success few could imagine. To him, she was just another speeding ticket. Maria pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked down the street, her mind racing. The reality was, she wasn't just a woman who had gotten caught in a minor violation. She was someone who had spent years struggling to be seen and recognized for her abilities, her intelligence, and her dreams. It wasn't always easy. As a child, she had always dreamed of flying, but those dreams were not encouraged. In a world where women of color were rarely seen in aviation, she had often been told that her ambitions were unrealistic, that it wasn't a career path meant for people like her. But she had pushed through that, working multiple jobs to pay for flying lessons and enduring countless obstacles just to earn the respect of others in an industry that had never been kind to women like her. The cold air did nothing to calm her nerves, but she walked steadily, her gaze fixed on the sidewalk ahead. As she crossed the street, she couldn't help but wonder how many other women had been dismissed in the same way. How many times people were judged based on their appearance or their background, not on their true potential. Maria knew she wasn't the only one who had ever felt the sting of being underestimated. The problem was, many people never had the opportunity to prove themselves, to rise above the judgments cast upon them. She reached her car and climbed inside, taking a deep breath as she started the engine. The hum of the vehicle was calming, but the frustration remained. The fine didn't bother her as much as the assumption that she was nothing more than a face in a system that didn't care about the context of her life or her journey. It was the way Judge Reynolds had looked at her, indifferently, without seeing the depth of her experiences. His dismissiveness stung more than the fine itself. He had no idea that, in that moment, he had missed the chance to understand who she was. Maria drove in silence, her mind still replaying the court session, the way the judge had barely acknowledged her presence. She tried to shake it off. It was just one instance in a life filled with battles. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply embedded these biases were in every part of society. How often had she been overlooked in other situations? How many times had she been dismissed as less than because of her race and gender? At home, she sat in her small but cozy apartment, staring at the walls that surrounded her. Walls that she had worked hard to fill with accomplishments, with awards, and the reminder that she was more than the labels others placed on her. She took out the framed photo of her graduation from the aviation school, the moment she became a certified pilot. That was her true identity, the one she had fought for. She had soared through the skies, defying the expectations of everyone who had told her she couldn't. That was who she really was. But the frustration remained, lingering like a shadow. She knew that she couldn't let the judge's assumptions define her. She would prove to herself and to the world that she was more than the stereotypes people placed upon her. She had already come so far. This fine, this moment of judgment, would not hold her back. A few days later, Judge Reynolds sat in his office, staring at the papers scattered across his desk. The case of Maria Williams was still fresh in his mind, though for reasons he hadn't expected. As he went over the details of her traffic violation once more, his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman he had barely looked at during the brief court session. She had been calm, composed, and polite despite the fine he had issued without hesitation. But something about her stuck with him, something he couldn't quite shake off. Judge Reynolds had seen hundreds of defendants come through his courtroom. Most were there for minor offenses like speeding, petty theft, or disorderly conduct. He had developed a routine over the years, a way of quickly assessing cases based on his own judgments and experiences. His decisions were swift, and he never second-guessed himself. But Maria Williams was different, and he couldn't understand why. It wasn't just her demeanor or the way she carried herself. It was the nagging feeling that there was more to her story, something he hadn't seen or acknowledged in that moment. His reverie was interrupted by his secretary, who handed him a thick envelope. It was from the local aviation school. The letter inside was an invitation to an upcoming graduation ceremony where the top students would be honored. The name Maria Williams was highlighted in bold. As Judge Reynolds read the letter, the weight of the words hit him like a physical blow. Maria wasn't just a woman caught speeding through a construction zone. She was one of the few women of color to graduate from a highly competitive aviation program, a certified pilot who had completed a rigorous and demanding training program. The very same woman he had dismissed as just another minor offender in his courtroom. The realization was staggering. He had looked at her through the lens of assumptions and stereotypes, reducing her to nothing more than a face in a system he had grown accustomed to handling with indifference. He had never bothered to ask about her background or acknowledge the obstacles she had likely faced to reach that point in her life. And now, here was a letter that revealed her true identity, one that had been completely invisible to him in the courtroom. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, staring at the letter for a long time. He felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. How could he have missed this? How could he have been so quick to judge someone without even knowing their story? The woman he had found was not just another person caught in the system. She was an accomplished, driven individual who had fought through adversity to achieve something extraordinary. His mind began to race as he thought about the implications of his mistake. What if Maria had been treated like this her entire life? What if others had treated her as less than, simply because of the color of her skin or the assumptions that came with it? Judge Reynolds had been so quick to impose his own biases, and in doing so, he had contributed to the very systems of inequality he had spent his career pretending to uphold with fairness. The guilt gnawed at him. He hadn't just misjudged her. He had participated in a pattern of behavior that contributed to the marginalization of people like Maria. She deserved better, and he knew that. But what could he do now? How could he make up for this mistake? He knew he couldn't undo the fine or take back the harsh judgment he had rendered, but perhaps there was something he could do to right the wrong. Maybe it wasn't too late to change his approach, to confront his biases head-on, and to make sure that no one else would ever be treated the way he had treated her. With a deep sigh, Judge Reynolds made a decision. He would reach out to Maria. He would apologize, and he would learn from this moment, even if it meant confronting the uncomfortable truths about himself. The following morning, Judge Reynolds found himself staring at his phone, unsure of how to make the first move. He had never been one for personal outreach, especially not under these circumstances. But the weight of his realization of the mistake he had made drove him to pick up the phone and dial the number for the local aviation school. After a few rings, the receptionist answered, and he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need to speak with Maria Williams," he said, his voice sounding foreign to himself. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he had hoped to find a way to explain, to apologize for the unfair judgment he had passed on her. The receptionist paused briefly before responding. "She's not available right now, but I can take a message. Would you like me to have her call you back?" "No," Judge Reynolds replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Please let her know that Judge Thomas Reynolds would like to meet with her. It's important." There was a moment of silence before the receptionist responded. "I'll pass along the message, Judge. Thank you." He'd hung up, his mind spinning with uncertainty. What could he possibly say to her? How could he begin to make amends for something so deeply ingrained in the system and in himself? The truth was, the guilt had been eating at him since the moment he'd discovered who she really was. He had underestimated her in the most profound way, and now he needed to face the reality of his own biases. Later that day, Maria received the message. She was sitting in her living room, going over flight schedules and reflecting on her recent accomplishments. She had just wrapped up a successful presentation at a local school where she had spoken to young students about the importance of pursuing their dreams, no matter the obstacles. Her story was one of persistence and defiance, a testament to everything she had achieved to become a certified pilot. When she saw the message from the aviation school receptionist, informing her that Judge Reynolds wanted to meet, she was taken aback. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, especially not after the brief interaction they had shared in court. She had dismissed it as another example of the systemic issues that plagued her life, another instance where a black woman was seen through the lens of stereotypes. But now, it seemed that the judge was asking for a face-to-face conversation, which only made her more curious. Maria sat there for a moment, contemplating the situation. Part of her wanted to ignore the request entirely. Why should she give him the time of day? He had dismissed her in court without a second thought, and she owed him nothing. But another part of her, the part that had fought so hard to prove her worth, was intrigued. What could he possibly want? And more importantly, what did he expect from her? After a few minutes of internal deliberation, Maria decided she would meet with him. Not because she owed him anything, but because this might be an opportunity to make a larger point, a chance to challenge the assumptions that had been placed upon her and to, perhaps, make him see the world in a different way. She wanted to know why he had been so quick to judge her, and if there was a way to hold him accountable for his actions, while also pushing him to reflect on his own biases. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, and Maria couldn't shake the mix of emotions swirling inside her. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, this was her chance to stand tall, to be seen for who she truly was, and to challenge the system that had so often overlooked her potential. Meanwhile, Judge Reynolds spent the rest of the day preparing for the meeting. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that he couldn't expect forgiveness or even understanding from Maria. But he also knew it was the right thing to do. He had to face her, to own his mistakes, and to prove to himself, if not to anyone else, that he was capable of change. The following afternoon, Maria walked into the small, unassuming cafe where she had agreed to meet Judge Reynolds. She had chosen this neutral setting carefully, a place where the weight of the courthouse, of judgment and authority, wouldn't hang over them. As she stepped inside, the warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the chill that still lingered in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but she knew she wasn't walking in with any preconceived notions of how it should go. Judge Reynolds was already there, sitting at a corner table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression somber. The moment he saw Maria, he stood up and greeted her, his voice gentle but unsure. "Ms. Williams, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Maria nodded but didn't sit down immediately. She studied him for a moment, noticing how uncomfortable he seemed, how much he was avoiding eye contact. It wasn't lost on her that, just days ago, this man had issued a fine without a second thought, without even considering who she was. Now he looked almost like a man who had been shaken by his own reflection. "Please sit down," he said after a beat, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Maria hesitated for a moment before finally sitting. There was no sense in prolonging the silence. They had come here to speak, and that's exactly what she planned to do. "I imagine you know why I asked to meet," Judge Reynolds began, his voice low. "I've had time to reflect on our interaction, and I realize now how wrong I was to judge you so quickly." Maria didn't respond immediately. She was still processing what he had said. The apology, if that was what it was, didn't feel complete. It was still too formal, too detached. He hadn't really explained why he had been so dismissive of her. And that was what she needed to understand, the root of his assumptions. "Do you know who I am?" Maria asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of curiosity. It was a simple question, but one that she wanted him to answer for himself. She didn't need him to recite her resume, but she wanted to see if he truly understood the person he had dismissed. Judge Reynolds faltered for a moment, looking down at the table before meeting her gaze. I know now that I didn't fully understand who you were when I issued that fine. I didn't ask, I didn't look deeper. I just assumed." Maria's eyes narrowed slightly, but she held her tongue. She was still waiting for him to truly reckon with his own biases, to understand why his assumptions were so harmful. "What did you assume?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. He sighed, a deep, almost exhausted sound. "I assumed you were just another woman, young, black, in a hurry, someone who probably wasn't paying attention to the rules. I didn't take the time to see that you might have a reason for being in that situation, or that you had worked harder than most people ever will to get where you are. I didn't see you as someone who had accomplished something significant, who had defied the odds to become a certified pilot." Maria felt a mix of emotions as she listened. On one hand, she appreciated the honesty in his words, but on the other hand, it still felt like too little too late. "And how does it feel," she asked slowly, "to realize that the person you judged is someone who had to fight every single day to be seen and respected in a world that told me my dreams were impossible?" Judge Reynolds looked down, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't shy away from her words. "It feels like I've failed," he admitted. "I failed you. And I failed myself, because I should have known better. I should have seen you for who you were before I made my decision. And for that, I'm sorry." Maria stared at him for a long moment, considering his apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He had admitted his mistake, not just the surface-level error of issuing a fine, but the deeper wrong of reducing her to a stereotype. She could see the guilt in his eyes, and for the first time, it felt like he was truly grappling with the impact of his actions. "I appreciate your apology," Maria said after a moment, her voice softer than before. "But it's not just about me. It's about the system that allowed you to make that judgment in the first place. You're not the only one who's been caught in that cycle. How many others have been overlooked, dismissed, or penalized because of assumptions like yours?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Judge Reynolds nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and resolve. I understand, and I'll do better. I'll work to make sure that my decisions from now on are informed by the full picture, not just the parts I'm comfortable with. Maria didn't respond immediately. She could see that he was sincere, and that was enough for now. But the journey wasn't over. Change would take time, not just for him, but for a system that was built on biases far deeper than one courtroom encounter. For the first time, Maria felt like she might have helped to spark a shift, a change not just in Judge Reynolds, but in a system that needed to see people for who they really were, not just the labels they were given. The weeks that followed the meeting with Judge Reynolds were filled with reflection and change, both for Maria and for him. Maria had returned to her busy life, flying planes, meeting with young students, and continuing to prove that she belonged in a world that often overlooked her. But there was something different in the air, something that kept her grounded even when the weight of everyday life seemed overwhelming. It wasn't just the reminder of her past struggles or her unyielding determination to be seen. It was the shift that had started within her as well. She had always known the power of her own story, of her ability to break barriers and defy the odds. But after the conversation with Judge Reynolds, she realized something deeper. The impact of truly being seen, not just for what people assumed, but for everything that had shaped her. She was more than a certified pilot or an inspiring figure in her community. She was a symbol of resilience, a challenge to the status quo that still held too many people back. Judge Reynolds, on the other hand, found himself grappling with the weight of his own transformation. The apology he had given to Maria had not been the end of the process, but rather the beginning of something much deeper. His interactions with her had triggered something he hadn't expected, the recognition of his own biases, not just as a judge, but as a man living in a world where inequality was deeply embedded in the very systems he had sworn to uphold. He had started to dig into his own motivations, to question the assumptions he had long made about people based on their appearance or background. It wasn't easy, and at times, it felt like a battle against everything he had been taught to believe. But he knew it was necessary. In the weeks following their meeting, Judge Reynolds had taken steps to learn more about the struggles faced by people of color in his community. He had met with local advocacy groups, attended workshops on racial biases in the justice system, and even read books and articles on the history of racism and discrimination in law enforcement. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just a figure of authority issuing sentences. He was a student trying to understand the very issues that had led him to make the mistake he had with Maria. One afternoon, he sat in his office, reflecting on the impact of his actions. He could see how the choices he made in the courtroom were not isolated from the world around him. They were shaped by a larger system, one that perpetuated racial and gender inequalities. He thought back to the day he had met Maria, the quiet but fierce woman who had stood in front of him and challenged everything he had assumed about her. She had shown him a side of the world he had been blind to, not out of malice, but because he had never been forced to confront it. Meanwhile, Maria's life continued, but she noticed a subtle change in her interactions with others. After the meeting with the judge, word had spread within her community, and she had started receiving messages of support, not just for her achievements, but for her willingness to stand up and be seen. People who had been skeptical of her dream to become a pilot, who had questioned whether she was capable, now looked at her with a renewed respect. It wasn't just about being a pilot anymore. It was about embodying the strength and perseverance that others found inspiring. She also noticed that, in her conversations with others, people were beginning to ask more thoughtful questions. They wanted to know about her struggles, her victories, her journey. She was no longer just a symbol of diversity in an otherwise homogeneous field. She had become a person whose story could help others understand what it took to overcome obstacles. But even with these changes, Maria was clear-eyed about the long road ahead. She knew that one meeting, one apology, couldn't fix everything. Judge Reynolds' acknowledgement of his mistake was an important step, but it was just that, one step in a much longer process of accountability and understanding. The justice system was still deeply flawed, and she couldn't afford to forget that. Still, there was something more hopeful in the air now, a sense that change was possible, even if it came one small conversation at a time. Judge Reynolds continued his work, more mindful of his role in the system and more determined to ensure that his future judgments were more than just about enforcing the law. They would be about seeing people for who they truly were, beyond the surface and the assumptions. And as for Maria, she kept flying, speaking, and living her truth, knowing that she had helped to spark a change in someone who might just be able to inspire further transformation in the world around him. The ripple effect had begun, and though it was small, it was powerful as months passed, and the changes that had begun with Maria's meeting with Judge Reynolds slowly began to manifest in the world around them. For Maria, the shift was palpable. She had always been driven by the need to prove herself, but now, more than ever, she realized that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked because of their identity. She continued her work as a certified pilot, taking on more flights, teaching, and mentoring aspiring aviators, particularly young people of color who had never seen someone who looked like them soaring in the sky. Her story, once relegated to conversations in small circles, was now shared more widely. She had become a symbol of defiance against the odds, but also a person of deep compassion, someone who wanted to make sure that no one else had to fight as hard to be seen for who they were. One afternoon, Maria was invited to speak at a prestigious aviation conference. It was a huge honor for her, as she had always seen this event as a place for the elite in aviation, a space where the most accomplished pilots gathered. But when she stepped onto the stage that day, she wasn't just representing herself. She was representing every person who had faced a closed door because of their race or gender. She spoke passionately about the need for diversity in the aviation industry, about how it wasn't just a moral issue, but a practical one. The skies are not limited by race or gender, she said, looking out at the diverse crowd in front of her. We should not allow the world on the ground to make those distinctions for us. As the crowd applauded, Maria felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. She wasn't just there to be the face of change. She was there to be an active participant in it, to push the conversation forward and ensure that the next generation of pilots wouldn't have to fight the same battles she had. Meanwhile, Judge Reynolds found himself continuing on his path of self-reflection and transformation. He had been following Maria's journey from a distance, reading her speeches and the stories about her. The woman who had once stood before him in his courtroom had become a catalyst for his own personal growth. He had started making small but significant changes in his own courtroom practices. He was more mindful of how he interacted with defendants, more aware of how his biases might have influenced his rulings in the past. He had even begun seeking advice from his colleagues about how to combat systemic issues in the legal system, specifically when it came to race and gender. One afternoon, Judge Reynolds decided to reach out to Maria once again. This time, however, it wasn't to apologize or to make amends. It was simply to express his gratitude. He wrote her a letter, one that was both personal and professional, thanking her for the impact she had made, not just on him, but on the larger conversation about justice, equality, and the power of one person's story to ignite change. In the letter, he wrote, "You have reminded me that the work of justice is not just about enforcing laws. It's about seeing people, truly seeing them, for who they are and what they are capable of. You've made me a better person and a better judge. I can't thank you enough for that." Maria received the letter with mixed emotions. She had moved past the anger and frustration she had felt in that courthouse, but there was still a part of her that couldn't forget how quickly she had been dismissed in the first place. However, as she read his words, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the apology, it was the acknowledgement of her journey and the impact she had had on him. It was the recognition that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. She wrote back, not with bitterness, but with understanding. She thanked him for his honesty and for the work he was doing to challenge his own biases. She also reminded him that real change wasn't just about individual transformations. It was about a collective effort to dismantle the systems that allowed discrimination and injustice to thrive. "I'm glad our paths crossed," she wrote, "but there's still much work to do. I'm not giving up, and I hope you won't either." The exchange between them, though brief, was more than just two people attempting to right a wrong. It was a testament to the power of growth, understanding, and the possibility of transformation, even when it seemed impossible. In that moment, both Maria and Judge Reynolds understood that they were part of something bigger than themselves, a movement toward fairness, equity, and justice. The ripple effect of their meeting had grown, and though the journey was far from over, they were both now more determined than ever to continue the work that had begun with one simple, yet transformative conversation. Months passed, and the ripples of change, set in motion by Maria and Judge Reynolds, began to expand in unexpected ways. Maria's career continued to thrive, but she was no longer just a pilot. She had become a powerful advocate for diversity and equity in aviation and beyond. Her story had inspired countless others, and she had begun to speak at major events, conferences, and educational institutions, sharing not just her journey to becoming a certified pilot, but her vision for a future where barriers of race, gender, and class were no longer obstacles to success. Through her outreach programs, Maria had also cultivated a strong network of young aviators, many of whom came from underrepresented communities. She was teaching them not just how to fly, but how to challenge stereotypes, to demand space in fields that had long been closed to them. Each day, she found new ways to use her platform to inspire and uplift, determined that her story wouldn't just be hers. It would be the story of everyone who was told they couldn't, shouldn't, or wouldn't succeed. One afternoon, Maria was invited to speak at a symposium on racial justice in professions traditionally dominated by white men. It was one of the largest audiences she had ever addressed. Standing before a room filled with people from all walks of life, she spoke passionately about her belief that real change required not only individual transformation, but a collective effort to overhaul the systems that perpetuated inequality. "You cannot just change the people at the top," she said, her voice strong and steady. "You have to change the system that keeps people like me from ever reaching the top. And that starts with making sure that every person, every single person, is seen, heard, and valued for what they bring to the table." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and many of those present came up to her afterward, expressing their gratitude and commitment to joining her in the fight for a more equitable future. It wasn't just her words that left an impression, it was the embodiment of her journey. She was living proof that persistence, vision, and courage could shatter barriers that seemed insurmountable. Meanwhile, Judge Reynolds continued to carry the lessons he had learned from Maria with him, though he knew that real progress required more than personal growth. He had taken what he learned from their meeting and was working within the judicial system to push for changes that addressed racial disparities in sentencing, to examine the ways in which bias infiltrated courtrooms, and to hold himself and his colleagues accountable. He knew that change wasn't just about correcting individual mistakes, it was about challenging the entire structure that allowed such mistakes to occur in the first place. One day, several months after their initial meeting, Judge Reynolds invited Maria to speak at a workshop he had organized for local judges and attorneys on racial bias in the justice system. It was a huge step for him, one that required a great deal of courage. He knew that inviting Maria to speak in front of his peers wasn't just an act of apology, it was a call to action. It was a way to show that he wasn't just changing his own perspective. He wanted to change the culture of the entire legal system. Maria accepted the invitation, though she was fully aware that it was a delicate moment. Speaking in front of a room of judges and attorneys, many of whom had spent years reinforcing the very biases she had spent her life challenging, was a daunting task. But she knew that this was part of the journey. Real change meant reaching those in positions of power and authority, and she wasn't going to shy away from the responsibility. When she spoke, her words were both a reflection of her journey and a call for a deeper, more systemic change. "We can't expect the system to change unless we're willing to look at our own roles within it," she told the room. "You, as judges, have the power to shape the lives of so many people. But with that power comes the responsibility to see them fully, not through the lens of bias, not through the filter of your assumptions. The room was silent as she spoke. Judge Reynolds watched her with a mix of admiration and respect, proud of how far she had come and of the courage it took for her to stand before the very people who had once dismissed her. As the event concluded, several judges approached Mariah, thanking her for her words and committing to further educate themselves about racial bias in their own work. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Change, after all, doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in countless small actions, in each decision made, and in every person who refuses to stay silent. For Mariah and Judge Reynolds, their paths had intersected at a pivotal moment in time. They had both learned that true transformation was not just about correcting mistakes, but about creating lasting change. Their individual journeys were far from over, but they now understood that they were part of something much larger, a movement towards equality and justice that could not be stopped. The ripples of their efforts would continue to spread, inspiring others to challenge their assumptions, confront their biases, and, like Mariah, rise above the barriers that tried to hold them back.